Hi, I'm Bruce Johnson. I've been at St. George's now for about 13 years, and it's been an interesting time. In those 13 years, I've really come to love it here. In that time, I've done various things. I started singing in the choir. I took part in the adult discussion group. I was on the vestry early on, and I'm now on my second term with the vestry. I was also people's warden for a while until I had to discontinue that because I was working on the Eastern Shore 3 days a week. As I said, I'm on the vestry again. I also chaired a communications task force when we reinvented the newsletter here, and I had what I think is probably the best newsletter in the Diocese of Maryland, at least for any that I saw. We had fun with that. We made it a feature sort of magazine instead of just announcements and so forth. So I've been involved quite a bit. I can't get involved with all the things I'd like to nowadays, but I still keep trying when I can.
Sure, wonderful. Well, Bruce, you've been here and for a long time, and you're well seasoned in terms of not just St. George's, but the church in general. What might you want to say to us about the stewardship program here over the years in St. George's?
I actually came from a church that was initially, it was very, I guess the word is proactive in its stewardship in terms of an every member canvass every year, and the idea of tithing as a standard to work toward. And in fact, back in those days when I was still married, we agreed to make tithing our standard, and by that I mean that we made sure that every year at least 10% of our income went to our pledge to the church and other charities that we were giving, and I've stuck with that as much as possible over the years. It's always been very important to me to do that now. Part of that is pledging, and there was a time recently after I was in the hospital, and then the contract I was working on post-retirement was cut. I couldn't make the pledge that I had made, and so midway through the year I did have to drop my pledge amount significantly, which I did, and it worked well. No one came to me. The pledge police didn't come and interrogate me as to why I had done such a terrible thing, and I think that's important to keep in mind when you do make a pledge, because if you make a pledge based on the circumstances you expect to encounter, and if those things change, you're free to change your pledge. So stewardship is important because that's the only way this community is supported. And whether you're talking time, talent, treasure, the whole thing, that's how St. George's exists.
Yeah, thank you. It keeps the community standing in many ways, and we all are a part of that. The church is not just the building, it is we the people. And I think you kind of hit the home run on that. I think you also hit a very good point when you mentioned the fact that circumstances arise, and sometimes we have to adjust. That is what stewardship is about. It's about being a manager, being responsible about what God gives us. And so sometimes that's going to require us to kind of step back and reassess, reevaluate our priorities and say, I can't afford this right now, and so therefore I will cut back because of such and such. I mean, it happens with church, but it also happens with life, So yeah, thank you for sharing that. What then would you want people to know about you as an individual and your relationship with God, and how that factors into why you give so much of yourself to the church?
Well, you didn't tell me the questions are going to be this hard. But, well, clearly we come from God, we are of God, and if it weren't for God, we wouldn't be here. And so it seems to be only rational, as well as something that comes from the Bible, of giving something back to God in return for all the blessings that we've received. I mean, I know I've been very blessed in my life. I've been blessed in terms of family. Lisa, my daughter, was a blessing as well as being a challenge. I was blessed to have a career that at least eventually became meaningful and challenging both. I was blessed to come back from a condition in the hospital where, as a friend of mine put it, I tried to check into heaven and St. Peter sent me back. And that was quite a blessing to come back. Even today, I'm reminded of it every time I have a medical test and the technician looks at my medical records and says things like, wow, you're a walking miracle. I say, wow, we don't get to see people like you very often. And of course, like anything else, it's a blessing, and I'm often wondering, what is the burden I have to pay back for that blessing? I really want to do more if I can for that. So yeah, and the blessing of St. George's is a community. And not everyone's had an experience like that, but everyone's had tough times, and I hope that they've felt the same support and prayerful backing that I felt from St. George's. I mean, I was still in, I guess it was the recovering room. I referred to it as the torture chamber. And I was visited by Nancy Walsh, who works at the Veterans Hospital next door and came by to visit.
Wonderful.
And then afterwards, the people of St. George's were so supportive with cards and prayers and meals, you name it, and visits. And that certainly, St. George's is a blessing to me. The community here, the way it's so inclusive of all people. You don't have to worry about what you wear or what you're wearing today or where you are in your faith journey.
Yeah.
I think people will accept you where you are.
Yeah, that's important. And it sounds like you hit another point that I want to touch on in terms of what this community is like and what your response has been to God for the ways in which He has blessed you through this community and in life generally. It's one of gratitude. And it sounds as if that love, as it has enveloped you, has moved you to give of your time, your talent, and your treasure. And that we are very happy and grateful for, and we appreciate the many ways in which you contribute. And I think you kind of touched on it, but if you would just expand a little bit more as to what would you want others to know about this community here at St. George's?
I thought about things like that, and there is so much. I came to St. George's 13 years ago after being in another church where I heard a sermon preached that I found so offensive I had to get up and leave in the middle of the service because I couldn't recite the creed and say we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, because I clearly didn't agree. My God was not the one being preached about. And so I actually went for several months unchurched. And thankfully, because I had worked with diocesan youth programs for a number of years a while back, there was one person in diocesan house then who I talked to, and she said, you really ought to try St. George's. You would like St. George's.
Bless her heart.
And and I said, St. George's, that's Hampstead, isn't it? I said, what, can anything good come from Hampstead? But I did in fact come, and the first person I met was Deacon Barbara, whom I had known 25 years before.
Wow.
And she said, yeah, I think this would be a good fit for you. And so I settled in and found it to be such a wonderful place, and people need to know that they can come here. And, you don't have to believe that in the same way that of everything that someone else does, because you're accepted anyway. It's, and I've never found anybody here who felt that your faith and your belief had to be the same as theirs, that they had all the right answers and the only ones, which is the problem I had run into before, really. And so it didn't take long to see the acceptance of people here, how there's such a variety of persons, and that everyone, accepted you for who you are. Wow. And clearly something good can come out of Hampstead, and it's right here in St. George's,
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And in many ways reminds us of what the gospel really is about. That God meets us where we are. He accepts us as perfectly imperfect, and He moves us to where He needs us to be. Or she needs us to be, right?
Thank you.
The God of our understanding. And so thank you for sharing. We appreciate it. And is there anything else that you would want us to know?
No, I'll just put a word in for the stewardship campaign,
Sure.
for the pledging campaign,
Sure.
because I think that's important. We talked about, their pledge being the best guests, and that you can make changes in it. But I think it's also interesting and important to look at the pledging campaign this year. From the way it's being done, that we actually, instead of gathering all the pledges together and then deciding what we can and can't put in a budget, we've set out a budget. And that budget is a very reasonable and, in my mind, restrictive budget. There are other things I would like to see in that budget. But this is what the Finance Committee came up with as our basic needs. And that's what we need to get to. And we can do this by pledging. So we need to look at where we are and how we get to meet those needs.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I think that's a good step in stewardship. to do it that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. Amidst all of the wonderful things that we can say about God and about St. George's, that we should never forget we have a responsibility, and ours is the duty to fill that responsibility, and that comes through pledging, that comes through giving of our time and our talent. It comes through stewardship. Well said.
Amen.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. And we look forward to many years of your continued service here. You're a blessing to us, and we hope that St. George's and this church can continue to be a blessing to you and your family.
Absolutely. Thank you.